talk about imperfect labor markets, right? So before we get started, let me give you a quick overview of what we have done so far within this topic of labor market, and then we'll move on and discuss imperfect labor market. And hopefully today we'll complete off with this topic, which will bring us towards completion of unit 3, right? Okay, now what is labor market? We already know a market where labor services are demanded and labor services are supplied. So that is known as labor market. Who demands labor? Companies. Who supplies labor? The individuals, like people who are willing to work, who are part of the working population of a country, right? Okay. Then in yesterday's class, we talked about perfect labor market. So before that, we have already discussed what is demand for labor, what is supply of labor. We will not go in that detail. You'll find all the lectures on the YouTube channel and all that stuff, right? But in the last class, we talked about perfect labor market, right? Now, just like there is perfect competition and imperfect competition in product market, similarly, there is perfect labor market and imperfect labor market in labor markets, right? So let's first understand what is perfect labor market, right? So think about this. So the perfect labor market is where there are many companies and firms available in the market to hire people and huge supply of workers who are willing to work, right? So there is, on one hand, there are a lot of companies who want to hire people, and on the other hand, there are a lot of people who are willing to work. That's perfect labor market we're talking about. Then workers have homogeneous skill set. What it basically means that they have similar skills. So you will not see a lot of variation when it comes to the skills that people possess, right? So they are quite similar. So whether a company hires Qasim or whether a company hires someone else, I mean, there won't be any huge difference, right? Then firms are wage takers. So if you remember, we talked about this. In fact, I'll quickly show you the graph for the perfect labor market once again. So firms are wage takers. Whatever prices are prevailing in the market, that is the price at which you whatever price wage is prevailing in the market, that is the wage at which you need to hire your workers. You can't afford to pay them anything less, because otherwise they will switch the company, right? They'll switch and start working for some other company, right? And workers have complete information about the nature of the job and working conditions, right? So workers have complete information about which companies are hiring, what salaries they're offering, what is the nature of the job, and so on, right? And workers are geographically and occupationally mobile, right? They can easily move between cities and between occupations as well, right? So a doctor can become a lawyer can become a teacher, and so on, right? I mean, in an ideal world, right? Which, I mean, to be very honest, is hard to find in, it's hard to find in a lot of labor markets, because obviously you need a lot of qualification, you need specific degrees to choose a certain occupation. So it's not that easy. But in some occupations, yeah, it might be possible, right? Okay. And then there are no external influences on wages, like there are no trade unions, government intervention doesn't exist, right? And there is no, things like external factors that could influence the wages in perfect labor market I'm talking about. Okay, now we'll do a quick recap of what we have done, like the graph of perfect labor market. So if you remember, we said that there will be two graphs that we'll draw. So one would be for the industry. So I'm drawing one on the industry on the left hand side, and then there would be one for the firm, which I'll draw in a bit, right? So you have wages on the y-axis, you have wages on the y-axis, you have, so you have wages on the y-axis, you have quantity of labor in the entire market, quantity of labor in the market on the x-axis, right? And this graph is for the industry, right? Or the market, the entire market, not for one firm, right? So this is showing you the situation for the market. And then on the left-hand side, you'll draw the graph for the firm, right? Okay. So here you have the graph for the firm, right? And similarly, you label the both axes similarly. So on the y-axis, you will have wages, and on the x-axis, you will have quantity of labor that one firm will hire. But this left-hand side graph is showing you the scenario for one firm, not for the entire market, but for one firm. Okay. Now, how are wages determined in the market? on the basis of market demand and market supply. So downward sloping will be a market demand like this, right? Which shows that what is the total quantity of people that all these different companies are willing to hire at different wage rates. I repeat, what is market demand? Market demand shows the total number of people that all companies in the market are willing to hire at different wage rates. So if you think about teachers, all companies, all schools, all online teaching platforms who are willing to hire teachers, um, and at different wage rates, how many teachers do the demand? That is represented by the market demand for teachers. And market supply, on the other hand, is the total number of people who are available to work in a certain occupation at different wage rates. We've already talked about this in detail, so I'll assume that it's clear. If not, please feel free to ask me. Okay, now where the market demand and market supply of a certain occupation is equal, right? So that will be the market wage for that occupation, right? So that would be equilibrium wage, market wage, whatever you want to call it. So wage M means market wage. Okay, now what you have to do, you just need to extend this market wage line, right? On the right hand side of the graph, right? And this straight horizontal line that you'll draw is representing the supply of labor, right? So there was some confusion about this in the last class preach, so let me clear that for you. So this is the straight horizontal line is showing you the supply of labor for one firm. For one firm, for mega lecture, the supply of teachers is perfectly elastic because there's so many people in the market who are willing to work as teachers, right? So at this wage rate, which is market wage rate, right, we can hire as many quantity of teachers as much we wish to. So it's not that the supply is limited. We don't even need to pay more wages to attract more labor. Why? Because it is the market wage that we're paying, and on this wage rate there is infinite number of people available to work with us, right? 50, 60, 70, any number, right? Okay, if this is clear, then I'll move on and I'll show you that where is the demand for this firm. So the demand for this particular firm will be also downward sloping graph like this, right? Which shows how many teachers would mega lectures or any other school or academy or online teaching platform would want to hire, right? So downward sloping is the MD, sorry, not market demand, my bad, firm demand for labor, right? So let's label it as demand for labor by one firm, right? DL. Okay. Now where the demand for labor by one firm is equal to the supply of labor, which is perfectly elastic over here, that will show you the equilibrium point, and that will tell you how many teachers will this one company hire. Let's say 50 teachers, right? Is it making sense? So that is what the equilibrium in perfect labor market looks like. Preet, is there any confusion? Is everything clear? Are we good? Okay, now moving forward from here, today we'll talk about imperfect labor markets. What is imperfect labor market? So if you remember, during our last class, I explained to you that all the assumptions that we made for the perfect labor market, you will reverse those, right? So let me try to fit both things in one screen so that you can compare, right? So this is on top, we have perfect labor market, and at the bottom of it, we have imperfect labor market. Now think about this. Firstly, where there are limited number of employers or limited workers to work, right? Now, there could be scenarios in real life where there are few firms that are hiring a certain type of occupation, a certain type of people. Why? Because those companies are generally limited, right? So I gave you the example of nuclear scientists. So who will hire nuclear scientists? Either some research centers who are researching about nuclear physics or whatever, right? Or any nuclear power plant which wants to make nuclear energy, or perhaps, I don't know, atomic energy guys who are making some, nuclear weapons, stuff like that. But it will always be very limited, right? In some countries, there might not be any organization who's looking to hire, nuclear scientists. So that's one possible example. Then workers do not have homogeneous skill set, right? So workers have different skill sets. Some people are quite qualified, other people are less qualified. They have different type of skills. They're not equally productive. Okay. firms or workers have disproportionate bargaining power against each other, right? So think about this. Sometimes it's firms that are more powerful because they are limited, or on the in other scenarios, it could be workers who are more who have more bargaining power because they have formed trade unions. They can, um, what is that called? They can pressurize companies to pay their workers more salaries, right? We know how what trade union is. And in today's lecture, we'll talk about how trade unions operate. So you'll get a better idea about that. Okay. There would be information asymmetry. One of the two groups can have more information compared to the other group, right? So for some reason, information is not, you know, available to everyone. Workers might not know about the vacancies that are available, and so on and so forth, right? Workers are not geographically and occupationally mobile. And we do see this happening in real life as well. So people are not very comfortable working in other cities of a country because they find one city, which might be their hometown, more livable, better, living conditions in that particular city compared to the other cities of the country. And international mobility is even more of a challenge, right? And similarly, occupational mobility is also difficult. As I was just telling you that, a doctor has, let's say, gotten a degree in 5 years, 6 years in medicine, and now all of a sudden, if that person wants to switch to become a lawyer or to become a teacher, then that person would need another qualification, another degree, which is obviously in itself very time consuming, and therefore people might not find this feasible, right? And then there are external factors influencing wages, like the one that I've discussed above. But just to be more specific, so there is government intervention, presence of trade unions, and monopsony, right? So in the last class, I told you what monopsony is. So monopsony is a market where there's a single employer. Single employer. Monopoly is different. Monopoly is when there's one producer of a product, right? So Pakistan Railway is a monopoly and a monopsony. How? Because railway services are only provided by Pakistan Railways in Pakistan, obviously I'm talking about. And monopsony is when there's a single employer. So any railway drivers or any railway mechanics, if there is such specialization, right? So those people will only be hired by Pakistan Railway because there is no other company in Pakistan that deals with, railway services and so on. Right? Are we getting this? Okay. Now, this being said, so let's get started and let's discuss each one of these one by one. So let's first talk about the trade union, right? So we said that when any of these factors are present, that's an imperfect market, right? What is a trade union? How trade union operates? That's the first thing that we'll talk about. Then we'll come to the monopsony part, and then we'll come to the government intervention, right? Okay. Now, so first of all, let's define this term, and then we'll build on that. Okay. Now, what is a trade union? So trade union is an organization / platform that represents workers in a certain firm, right? Okay. Of is to advocate for workers' rights in terms of higher salaries, better conditions. Okay. Now, have a look at this, right? So what is a trade union? Trade union is an organization or a platform, right, that represents workers in a certain firm or industry, the purpose of which is to advocate for workers' right in terms of higher salaries and better working conditions, right? So workers working in a certain company or in a certain industry will form a trade union, and they all become part of it, right? So let's say Auto Workers Association. Now, what does Auto Workers Association would represent? All people in Pakistan who are working in auto manufacturing companies, right? Toyota, Honda, Suzuki, there might be a couple more, right? So they have formed a trade union, a platform through which they advocate for their rights. So if they're asking for more salaries and their employers are not accepting those demands, then they have ways to get that accepted, which we are coming to. And that is known as these methods that they use, by the way, which includes going on a strike, which includes protesting, which includes a few other techniques that I'll discuss in a bit. These are known as industrial action. So, right? Um, so industrial action refers by used by to pressurize employers, firms, accept demands, right? Now think about this. So what happens that obviously companies would not be interested in paying their workers higher wages or salaries. Sometimes they might be fine with it, but on other instances they will not be comfortable. Why? Because that means higher cost for the companies. Higher cost means lower profits, right? So when workers see that their demands are not being accepted, let's say they were asking for 5% increase in wages, or let's say 10% increase in wages, or they were asking for something else, let's say they wanted health insurance for all of their members and stuff like that. But if the company has outrightly rejected that, then industrial action takes place, right? Now what happens in industrial action? These are the techniques or strategies, you can say. It refers to techniques used by trade unions to pressurize employers to accept their demands, like protest, right? So they come to streets having, placards in their hands saying that, we are being oppressed, we are not being uh, treated fairly and things like that. So protest is one of those. Going on a strike, and go slow is another strategy that they, in their workplace, they come to work, they do their work, but they're not doing it efficiently, they're not doing it productively, they are kind of wasting time and they're wasting resources. So that is known as go slow. And then there is another popular strategy, overtime ban, right? Now what all these things are doing, all of these things are kind of hurting the company. How are they hurting the company? Because the production would not be as the company as much what the company would want to. Work is not taking place very efficiently and things like that. Therefore they will miss out on their orders, their demand, their customers would be affected, and so on and so forth. So to put pressure on the company to accept their demands, these are some of the strategies that they use, and this is known as industrial action, right? Okay, then this being said, what is the solution, right? What is the solution, right? uh, how do they reach a middle ground? Because obviously if the workers are not coming to work, or let's say they're protesting constantly for certain time period and they're not coming to work, then obviously the company would not pay them the wages and the salaries. Production is on halt, production is not taking place, and all these things. Then both the parties need to, they do realize in fact that they have to reach a middle ground, and that is known as, in that case there are two options. In case the agreement parties have two options, or tribunal. Okay, now this might be another new word for you. Now think about this. In case there is this agreement between the two parties is not coming to resolution, and obviously something needs to be done about it so that things could move forward and so on. So what options these parties have? Either they take the issue to the court, right? So there are labor courts in every country nowadays, right? Or they can take it to the industrial tribunal. Now what is industrial tribunal? I mean, industrial tribunal, in fact, let me write this down for you. So industrial tribunal is any independent party, entity would be a better word, entity where judge, personal, uh, trusted on behalf. I think about this. Industrial tribunal. What is industrial tribunal? So court is very simple, right? So court is, you know what a court is. We have always grown up hearing what a court is, right? When people do something wrong, it's taken to the court. Court decides whether to punish the person, not to punish the person, who is at fault, blah, blah, blah. Industrial tribunal is also out of court settlement. Out of court settlement. What is out of court settlement? Out of court settlement is when both parties, right? Like in this case, trade union and the company have agreed upon a person, could be a group of people, could be anyone, right? So that's why that's why I wrote that it could be a lawyer, a judge, or business personnel to whom both parties have trusted to make a decision. So it's basically working as a court. Industrial tribunal is also working as a court. So both parties present their sides, that a trade union will tell that why they want higher wages or why they want better working conditions. The company would tell why they can't do that, blah, 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 whatever, right? So after hearing to both sides of the, both parties, then industrial tribunal will decide, what needs to be done, how the issue should be resolved, just like what the court does, right? And then just like it is binding, whatever decision is made by the court, it's binding, like you can't avoid it. Decision has been made. Similarly, whatever decision the industrial tribunal makes, that is also binding for both the parties. Does it make sense? Breathe. Anything that's confusing at this point, anything you want to ask me, any clarification you need, right? So we have just very quickly done an overview of how trade unions operate, what their objectives are, and how issues are sorted between companies and trade unions, right? So first thing that we discussed, that trade union is a platform that represents workers in any firm or in an industry, and they're working for workers' right to protect their interests, right? Then if their demands are not being met, the option that trade unions take is industrial action. They go on strikes, they go on protest and things like that. In case still that issue is pending and the issue is not coming to resolution, then there are two options. Either take the issue to the court and let the court decide what needs to be done about it, or else take it to the industrial tribunal, and that entity, that party, or that group of individuals who are kind of the judge, in that case, they will decide how to go about it, right? So this is how trade union works. Now, coming to the graph side of it, now think about this. What exactly a trade union is doing is that it basically puts pressure on the company by restricting the supply of labor, right? Now think about this. So for any given firm, right? So let's say you have wages on the y-axis, right? Like always, and you have quantity of labor on the x-axis. Now for any single firm, or could be for the entire market as well, depending upon how much powerful or influential is the labor market, right? So before before trade union became active, this was the demand for labor, right? Downward sloping demand for labor, and this upward sloping was your supply for labor. Now, when trade unions become active, what they actually do is that they restrict labor supply. How do they restrict labor supply? First of all, if they're going on, the workers are on strike, they are on protest, especially strike, they're not showing to workplace at all. So they're not coming to workplace, so supply of labor is completely disrupted for the company, right? Now, that also depends that what percentage of company employees are part of the labor union. Labor union, trade union means the same thing, by the way. What percentage of companies, why is this important, Preet? Can you give me, can you think of a reason? What percentage of company, right, employees are part of trade union? Now, this is important, let me tell you, because think about this. If there is a big proportion of workers who are part of the labor union, right, then that means, let's say 80-90%. So if a big chunk of companies' employees are part of the labor union, then obviously they will have more bargaining power. On the other hand, if only 5% or 10% of employees are part of the trade union and only those 5 or 10% of workers are protesting, then technically, I mean, it would not be very difficult for the company to replace those workers and, get new workers on board, or let's say to work without even, work without those people and things like that. So now, this being said, let me also write this down for you. So if there is a bigger proportion of companies' employees that are part of the trade union, then it will give trade union more bargaining power, right? And vice versa. As I said, Preet, is it making sense, right? Okay. Then there's another term that you need to know, part of the labor union. Then it would give the trade union more bargaining power and vice versa. Okay. Now, in some cases, there are two options, right? So if you talk about the nature of trade unions, so you will see that there are two types of trade unions that exist. One is known as closed shop, right? Again, this might be a new word for you. So one is known as closed shop and the other one is known as open shop, right? So what is the difference between closed shop and open shop? So closed shop means that it's mandatory for every employee to be part of the trade union, when it's compulsory every employee to be part of trade union, right? So you do not have any option but to join that union, right? And why would that be the case? So that would be the case because obviously union wants more bargaining power. Union wants more bargaining power. Does it make sense, right? So for closed shop, it will give more bargaining power to the trade union because everyone is part of it. So when they're boycotting, let's say they're going on strike or they're going on protest, then they know that everyone will join them, right? On the other hand, open shop is when union membership is voluntary, right? Which means that obviously you can join if you want to, you may choose not to join. That's also perfectly fine, right? So open shop is opposite to that. Increase the strength of the union. Exactly. Absolutely. Very good. Perfect, right? Okay. Is when union membership is voluntary. Okay. So this being said, we talked about what trade union is, how it operates, and what it actually targets is basically the supply of labor. So by going on protest or by going on strikes or by not working as efficiently as they should have had, that reduces the supply of labor in the market, which means that the pressure would build up and therefore the market wages can go up, right? So if this was the initial supply for labor for a certain firm and this was the initial demand for labor and for the firm, right? Then with trade union into picture, the supply curve can shift to the left, right? How so? Because now some of the members are going on protest and they're not showing up and so on and so forth. Therefore, it will put an upward pressure for the firm, upward pressure on the prices, upward pressure on the wages, right? So let's say if this was your initial equilibrium wage, now with lesser supply of labor, you can see for yourself, right? So equilibrium wages will go up, right? Like this. This makes sense, right? So that's what you need to know about. Okay. Now this is just one of the example of imperfect labor markets. This is just one of the examples of imperfect labor markets. There are two more examples that we need to discuss: the government and monopsony, right? So let's first talk about the monopsony market. Now, what is monopsony? So monopsony is single employer for a certain type of labor, right? Monopsony is refers to certain type of labor, right? So when for a certain type of labor, there's only one employer in the market, that is known as monopsony. Okay. Now, for reference purposes, if we can also take the example, for example, let's say be hired by research centers conducting research on. You can totally use these examples in your exam, right? Conducting research on nuclear energy or nuclear weapons, which is definitely a very dangerous thing, right? And so on, right? Okay, so think about this. So as I said, monopsony is when in a market there are a couple of people who have a certain skill set. But to hire those people, it's only one company or one organization who is interested, because the nature of the work is so unique that there can't be a couple of firms, right? So if you think of teachers, there will be hundreds and thousands of organizations, companies, firms who want to hire teachers. If you think of doctors in any country, there will be hundreds and thousands of companies interested in hiring doctors. Similarly, engineers, similarly, data scientists, and so on, right? Marketing people, finance people, accountants, right? Lawyers. But not happens for things like very unique skill set, which might be, nuclear scientists and things like that, right? Okay, now this being said, we will move on and look at how the graph for monopsony will look like, right? Okay, now Preet, have a look at this. Now, what happens in the monopsony market, that knowing monopsonist, we can also say monopsonist, right? So monopsonist, knowing that it is the only firm that can hire people with these skill set, right? They know that they have a lot of bargaining power against their workers. They know that they have a lot of bargaining power against their workers. So what they will do actually is that they will pay them less than what the competitive market pays. I repeat myself, right? So in monopsony, the company knowing that they can afford to pay less to their workers. Why? Because there is no alternative. The workers don't have an alternative. So it's not that either they can work in your company or your organization, or else they could go and work someplace else. There is no alternative. There is no someplace else, right? So monopsonist can afford to pay them lesser than what they are paid in competitive market, right? Now think about this. First thing that we'll draw is the normal downward sloping demand curve, right? That how much is the demand for labor by monopsony, right? So this is the demand for labor, right? Then you have to make two more graphs, which I'll explain you what they show. So one would be the normal supply, right? Which we saw that the supply of labor in competitive market, right? In competitive market, right? Supply of labor, SL. Then there's another thing which is known as marginal cost of labor. So marginal cost of labor, let me explain you what that is. By the term, you must have already understood that marginal cost is the additional cost of hiring labor. Now that is higher than supply of labor, because to hire more people, you need to give them more incentives and stuff like that, right? So if you want to attract more workers, each additional worker will require more wages, and the marginal cost of labor is higher than the supply of labor, right? Now, this being said, what happens in the competitive market? In competitive market, the idea is fairly simple. That where the supply of labor is equals to the demand for labor, right? So that is the equilibrium point. So this is where the two graphs are intersecting. So in competitive market, this much quantity of labor will be hired. So let me write this down as QC. So quantity of labor hired in competitive market, perfect labor market, which we discussed before this. And this is the wage that will be paid in the competitive market, right? Where the supply of labor is equal to the demand for labor, that determines equilibrium in perfect labor market. And therefore, the x-axis shows you the quantity of labor hired in competitive market. I've written it as QC, and the wages paid in competitive market, WC. Okay, but how does a monopsony operate? So monopsony would hire people where the marginal cost, because they're profit maximizing entity, so where the marginal cost is equals to technically the marginal revenue. Do you remember that the demand for labor is equals to its marginal revenue product of labor? So where the marginal cost of labor is equals to the marginal revenue that the labor generates for the company. So this is the quantity which will be hired by the monopsony right? So you can clearly see that they're hiring less than what competitive market would have hired. So QM is monopsony, M represents monopsony, right? And how much wages they will pay? So they will pay them the wages according to the supply of labor, right? So they will not pay them at this level. They will not pay them at this level. So they will pay them less than this. Why so? Because they know that they are the only firm who can hire this type of labor. Does it make sense? Breathe. Let's look at this one more time, right? Because I know this could be confusing, right? So let's look at this equilibrium part again. Okay. Now, think about this. First thing that we already know is that monopsony is a single employer in the market, right? So no other company can hire that type of people, right? Because their skill is not demanded by anyone, simply speaking. Okay. Now, think about this. In a competitive market, wages are based on the supply and demand for labor. As simple as that. How much labor is available to work at different wage rates? How many labor is being demanded at different wage rates, where the two are equal, which is this point, right? That will be the equilibrium point in competitive market. You stretch, you bring this dotted line down to the x-axis, and that will show you how much quantity of labor will be hired. So let me write this down as QC, quantity of labor hired in competitive market, and you connect it to the y-axis to see how much wages each person would earn in this market, right? WC, wages earned in competitive market. On the other hand, in case of monopsony, monopsony is profit maximizing entity, just like any other private business, they're profit maximizing entity. So what monopsony does is that it hires people. So monopsony hires people where the marginal cost of labor, right, is equals to the marginal revenue. So how much it costs to hire labor, how much is the additional cost of each unit of labor? That is what monopsony considers, and see how much additional revenue would that person generate for them, which is basically the demand curve of labor, because it shows marginal revenue product of labor. So to maximize its profit, monopsony will hire at the point where the marginal cost of hiring labor is equals to its is equal uh, to the benefit that labor generates for them, which is marginal revenue, right? So this is the quantity of labor. This is the quantity of labor that the monopsony will hire, QM, but they don't pay labor according to this wage rate. So they're not paying them. Why do they not pay them a higher wage? Because they know they are the only firm in the market that can hire this type of skill set. So they'll pay their workers at the level where it equals their supply, right? So think about this. In this case, if you see that monopsony is paying workers less than what they earn in competitive market, and they're also hiring less number of people as compared to what a competitive market would have. Got it? So that is how we show monopsony on a graph and how it operates. Right? Now, what are the solutions for that? Now, think about this. Now, another thing that you need to keep in mind, whether the monopsony is based in private sector, whether monopsony is a private sector firm or monopsony is a public sector firm, that is what you need to compare, right? Right, that is what you need to compare. So as I was giving you the example of nuclear research centers and so on, so if that is government owned, then they might not exploit their workers that much, because obviously government has a reputation and stuff like that, right? But if it's a private sector monopsony, then definitely they will try to maximize their benefit, and in the process they might exploit labor, sorry, right? We good on this, right? Any confusion so far? Please? Says less because reputation likely is private sector firm, right? Does this make sense? Okay, now let's read this again. If monopsony is government owned, then chances of labor being exploited are less because government is careful with its reputation, but this is less likely to be the case for a private sector firm, right? We good? Okay, perfect. Now moving forward and let's talk about the government intervention, right? Now let's first understand what is government incentive, or what is government, objective to intervene in the markets, in the labor markets, I mean, right? So government obviously being the regulatory authority in any economy, especially in mixed economy, government uh, is on the outlook of areas where which needs improvement or which needs to be regulated and all that stuff. Right? Now, if government observes that there is some exploitation going on, just like government looks for exploitation of consumers in product markets, similarly, government looks for some uh, you know exploitation that might be taking place in the labor market, and to correct that, government intervenes from time to time, or government make rules and policies around that. Okay, now just to quickly write this down. And to Right. So government's objective in a mixed economy is to regulate the markets to ensure their smooth functioning and to prevent any exploitation that might be taking place. Right. Okay. Now, what are some of the ways in which government intervenes in labor market? Because obviously, in this topic, we're only concerned about the labor market. We're not concerned about consumer exploitation or any other thing, right? So, some ways in which So can you think of some possible ways in which the government intervenes in labor markets, right? So one thing that is very common, right, and we see not only in developing countries like Pakistan, India, China, right? We also see this happening in developed countries, right? So minimum wage will come to it, but very simply speaking, it is where the government sets the bare minimum, right? The lowest possible wage that you can pay to your workers, right? So in Pakistan, currently, I think it is 17,000 rupees per month, not very sure, per month. So if someone is working full time in any organization for anyone, you have to pay that person at least that minimum wage. That is how it works. It could also be per hour. So if someone is working on hourly basis, in let's say Pakistan, so you can't afford to you can't pay them anything less than let's say 150 rupees or let's say 200 rupees or whatever, right? So there has to be a minimum benchmark that you have to pay to your workers, right? So that's minimum wage. Then another way through which government regulates labor market is through making and policies, right? So child labor is prohibited. Now, what exactly would uh, consist of child labor? That is something for the government to decide, right? So whether you decide that anyone below the age of 16 working is child labor, or whether you decide anyone working below the age of 18 is child labor, and things like that. So that is up upon the government to decide. Okay, making rules and policies like child labor, right? And then other things that the government does is you know, yeah. So these are the two main things that are coming to my mind right now, right? Another thing, yeah, sorry, how can I forget? Um, but that would also be part of rules and policies, right? Working conditions, uh, guidelines, right? Okay, now this being said, we'll move on and look at how government interventions will affect the labor market. Okay, now think about this. So without government intervention, now this is a very important thing. Without government intervention, let's say the government doesn't intervene in labor markets at all and let the market forces decide, right? Let the market forces determine the equilibrium, let the market forces decide what will be the outcome. Then in that case, the idea is very simple, what we have been looking at again and again, that it will only be the demand and supply of labor that will determine the wages, right? So in absence of external factors like trade unions or government and so on, right, the outcome in labor market is only based on market forces of demand and supply, right? So you will simply have a downward sloping demand for labor in the market. You will simply have upward sloping supply of labor in the market, right? And where the two intersect, that is the equilibrium, right? Supply of labor, demand for labor, this is the equilibrium in labor market in absence of government intervention or in absence of trade unions, right? But when governments are present, that makes it different. Okay, think about this. So without government intervention, let me show you two scenarios, one with government intervention and one without government intervention. So the first one without government intervention, let's say this is the supply of labor, and let's take some specific example over here, right? So who are the people who earn the lowest in any economy, right? So less educated people who usually work as manual workers or supply of construction workers, right? So let's think of construction workers who are doing manual tasks, right? Lifting load and loading, unloading, and things like that, right? So that CW means construction workers. So this is the supply of construction workers in any country, let's say Pakistan. And this downward sloping is the demand for construction workers in our country, right? Now, where the two are intersecting, where the supply and demand of construction workers is equal, so let's say that will determine how much they are paid on, let's say, a monthly basis, I'm saying, right? So let's say currently on the basis of supply and demand, 12,000 is the wage that the market is determining that should be paid to construction workers. And how many construction workers are hired in Pakistan? Let's say 1.5 million, could be any number. Okay. Now, this being said, this was the equilibrium in the labor market before government intervened. Now, government realizes, let's say, that this 12,000 rupees is too less considering the inflation, considering, other factors, right? Government thinks, let's say, that this 12,000 rupees per month is too low for anyone to afford a decent living or to, sustain a family and things like that. So what will government do? Government will set a minimum wage. So that minimum wage would be just like minimum prices that you would have, minimum prices that are set above the equilibrium, right? So this minimum wage, sorry about that. So the minimum wage will show you the least possible compensation that you have to offer to your workers, right? So this is your minimum wage, which you can see is higher than the equilibrium wage, right? So could be 16,000 rupees, could be 20,000 rupees, could be anything, right? So think about this. This is, let's say, 20,000 rupees. Now, okay, the government made the rule and the government, officially announced it that from now onwards, the minimum wage for this type of worker who's working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, full-time employee or whatever, right, should be paid at least 20,000 rupees per month. Anything more is fine. So if the wage you are paying to anyone above this, that's perfectly fine. But if you pay them anything less, that's not acceptable. Now, based on the market forces, the firms knew that, current market rate was 12,000. Okay. Obviously, companies do want to pay 12,000 because that saves them cost and all that. But now the policy has been implemented. Now, at this wage rate, this minimum wage rate, you can see for yourself that it is cutting with the labor supply at this point, right? So that means what? That there are more workers. Obviously, when you offer workers something more, so they will be more than happy to, more people will be interested in working for that occupation, working in that occupation, right? So now think about this. Let's say at this wage rate now, which is the minimum wage, right? How many people are willing to work? So where this wage intersects with the supply of labor, that will show you on the x-axis, will show you how much quantity of workers are willing to work. And where this wage rate intersects with your demand curve, that shows, when you connect it to the y-axis, that shows how many people will be demanded at this wage rate. Now, since this wage rate is higher than the equilibrium wage, obviously demand would be less. So let's say it is equals to 0.5. So 0.5 million people are demanded by companies at 20,000 rupees per month, whereas 2.5 million workers in Pakistan are willing to work at this wage rate. So what that actually creates is surplus of labor. What is this creating? That is creating surplus of labor. So more people are available to work compared to what is being demanded, and that is how government is creating an inefficiency in the labor market. That is how government is creating an inefficiency in the labor market. Now, what will happen? Whenever minimum wages are introduced, since those are not according to the market forces, then what happens? There would be some cases where labor is still paid, and I'm sure that is happening in Pakistan as well, right? Some people are paid, still not paid the minimum wages because, supply is definitely more to the demand, and there you will find people who will be interested in working for something less, and so on, right? So the exploitation to some extent continues. And even if this law is implemented and there is no loophole and everything, then the problem is that there would not be enough jobs for the people to work because the wage rate is now higher. Not many companies are interested in hiring this, and they will start looking for alternatives that how can they replace construction workers with other factors of production, like using more machines, more technology, and things like that, right? So it's not always in the best interest of the labor to use policies like minimum wages. Does this help? Preet, is it making sense? Right? So that was the first one. Then moving on to the second one, making rules and policies. So again, when you make policies around child labor, working conditions, I'm not saying that those are not important. Those are more than important, right? But what happens actually is that it increases the cost of um, hiring labor, right? So it increases. So whenever these policies are made, when you have to improve the working conditions of for the workers, and you cannot hire child labor, which let's say previously was happening, right? Then companies' cost of hiring and retaining labor is higher, which would obviously again mean that they would want to look for alternatives where they can replace labor with machines and other technology. Are we good on this? Right? Is this clear? Okay, let's keep moving. So, Preet, let's do a quick recap, and then this brings us towards completion of this topic, imperfect labor market, and then we'll start off with another last topic within labor market that we need to cover before we complete our labor market topic. Okay, now think about this. So we started our discussion about what imperfect labor markets are. We said that we have already discussed about the assumptions that there are limited number of employers who are willing to hire people, and there are limited number of workers who are willing to work. First thing, workers do not have homogeneous skill set. Due to different reasons, the bargaining power could be very different, disproportionate, meaning sometimes trade unions are really powerful and workers have more bargaining power. On the other hand, sometimes firms are limited and therefore they have more bargaining power. Information is not complete. Workers are not mobile in terms of geographical mobility, in terms of occupational mobility, and there are external influences, external factors that influence wages, like trade union and government intervention. Now, then within that, we said there are three possibilities, right? So in these three possible scenarios, there would be imperfect labor markets. First being trade union, second being monopsony, and third being government intervention. What is trade union? We talked about it, an organization that represents and work for workers' rights. They pressurize companies to pay their members more wages, and if their demands are not being met, they take industrial action. Now, when industrial action is taking place and still no conclusion is being reached, then you have two options: either both the parties go to the labor court to get the issue resolved, or they take it to the industrial tribunal, which decides the dispute between the two parties, right? Then we also talked about that in which case would trade union have more bargaining power. So if it's a closed shop where everyone needs to be part of it, where every member, every employee of the company has to be member of it, then obviously labor union would have more bargaining power. On the other hand, if it's open shop where the membership is voluntary, then obviously it will have less bargaining power. Okay. Now, what is monopsony? We talked in detail. Monopsony is where there's a single employer, and monopsony know that it's the only employer in the market, so it can exploit the consumer. And how it does that, that unlike competitive labor markets where the wages are based on market demand and market supply of labor, in this case, monopsony hire people where the marginal cost of labor, right, which is the additional cost of hiring one more unit of labor, is equals to the marginal revenue product of labor, which is equals to the marginal revenue that the labor generates for the company, right? So since it's a profit maximizing entity, monopsony is a profit maximizing entity. So all they care about is what output of labor, what level of labor would maximize their profit. So where the marginal cost of labor is equals to marginal revenue, that is the quantity of labor that the monopsony will hire, and they pay them, but they pay them according to the market supply of labor, which is less than what the competitive market would pay. So this is what shows exploitation taking place in monopsony market. And then at the end, we talked about government intervention, where the government makes rules and regulations to protect the rights of workers, which is not always a good thing. Why? Because for workers, yeah, that might be great, but that increases cost of hiring for firms, and therefore they start looking for alternatives like more machines and so on. When that happens, obviously the population of the country is still the same or perhaps growing, but there are less jobs available because companies have already replaced people with technology, and that is what we see happening very rapidly in the last few years, given the rapid development of technology in different domains and so on, right? So people are losing their jobs, right? Because a lot of things that previously used to be done manually are now being automated. There are machines, programs, softwares, technology available to do that, right? Now you need less people. Companies need less people to get the same type of work done as much as was the case previously. Okay, then we also looked at the minimum wage. We looked at that, government sets the minimum amount that needs to be paid to the labor, which means more supply, less demand, and therefore that results in unemployment, right? So again, minimum wage is also not always best policy, uh, best policy, because on one hand, it might be benefiting people who are receiving the minimum wage, but on the other hand, it could be disadvantageous for workers who are not finding jobs, because now at the minimum wage rate, there will be more supply and less demand, right? As we saw on the graph, right? Surplus of labor means unemployment. Okay. Now, this being said, so please just give me a second. I'll be back real quick, right? I need to put my laptop on charging, and then we'll continue from here.